The Florida Podcast Network, the voice of Florida.
From Mallory Square in Key West to the Governor's Mansion in Tallahassee and all points beyond, you're listening to the Florida Beer Podcast, powered by FloridaBeerBlog.com, your source for all things related to the craft beer community in the Sunshine State. And now your host, Dave Butler.
Welcome to our next episode of the Florida Mezcal Podcast. I really should just get a separate one just for Mezcal because I love it so much. Anyways, this is Dave, your host and author. We are still recovering and getting you all sorts of really awesome stuff from Mezcal Lauderdale 2024. This is the last of our pre-recorded interviews before the event actually took place. And this is William Scanlan from Heavy Metl Premium Imports, and they easily had the biggest variety of varietals at the event. They have a lot of phenomenal brands that are under their catalog, and I do recommend that you check out our show notes to check out their website to see everybody cool like Real Minero, Campero, and much more. William was not at the event. His Florida territory manager, I guess we should say, he was there. And had a great interview with him. Love to talk to him. There's some really good stuff that we were able to chat about during the event. But I do kind of want to get into a little bit more about the company itself and how they decided what brands to bring in, and obviously the brands that they brought in. So this is William Scanlan from Heavy Metl Premium Imports on the Florida Beer Podcast. Enjoy. How did you get involved in Mezcal?
Yeah, so it's kind of a long story, but in short, I was lucky enough to go to a Mezcal tasting in Austin in about the year 2000, 2001. Having grown up in San Antonio, having family in the Rio Grande Valley, we traveled to Mexico often and really had kind of an affinity for interior Mexican food and not so much Tex-Mex. And so every once in a while, I would go to get my interior Mexican fix at a place up on Burnett Road in Austin called Curra's Grill. It was all interior Mexican food, and I'd go in and drink tequila. And one night the GM was like, "Hey, we're doing this Mezcal thing in a couple of weeks. You should come in." I was like, don't know about that. Not really into the smoky tequila with a worm. And the dude's like, just come in. If you don't like it, you don't pay. Went in and had my mind blown. It was the Del Maguey tasting with Ron Cooper way back in the day. And a few years later, ended up getting my MBA in Austin, moving down to Oaxaca, and opening up a UPS store or mailbox, etc. in 2006. And when I got down there, I began to taste these mezcales and realizing that there was so much more going on than what I had experienced in Texas. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. Of course, I had just jumped into this other business, and it wasn't the right time to try to do something else. And so did the mailboxes, etc. thing up until about 12. I moved from Oaxaca to Mexico City, had an opportunity to sell that off, and decided to do a mezcal brand. And so living in Mexico City, I figured, hey, if I'm going to do this thing, I better become an expert. And I started going to conferences. I had little trade shows attached to them, like Agave Fest, Expo Agave, Lauderdale, where you had academics, you had biologists, archaeologists, anthropologists, industry leaders like Miguel Ángel Partida from Chacolo, Graciela Angeles of Real Minero. And I really went into learn as much as I could. And the more and more I dug into this thing, began to realize that there were different distillation techniques within Oaxaca, different agaves in different states, different distillation techniques. And I was like, holy moly, how am I going to do this the right way? and was really kind of struggling with this, began traveling around, visiting producers in different states, and began to realize that this was really more about like tradition and culture and an inheritance or transfer of knowledge from one generation to another. And was really struggling with how to do this the right way. And it was at, I think it was Agave Fest in 2013, where buddy of mine, Eric Rodriguez, grabbed me and was like, hey, you've got to come see this thing. Rey Campero Jabalí. Eric's known for sourcing rare and unique mezcales throughout Mexico, and he had never seen jabalí. So he drags me over to this table. They pour me the jabalí. I was like, no, let me start with this espadín. Tasted through the line, got to the jabalí, and that's when I had this aha moment and said, wait a minute, I don't want to have my own brand, but rather I want to work with families who have their own brands and are representing the category in different ways. So that was kind of where the idea of Heavy Metl was born. Asked Rey Campero or the Sanchez at that fair if I could come visit them in Oaxaca. Graciela Angeles and Real Minero was also there, and quickly went over to their table and said, hey, I'd like to come visit you. And it was going down, visiting with them, talking to them, and it was kind of a courtship in a way. They finally kind of entrusted me with their family brands. I've got no experience in the spirits or alcohol world, and somehow, I guess my passion and enthusiasm for the category won their trust.
Well, it's got to be a big jump going from operating a UPS mailbox store to importing spirits from Mexico to the US.
Absolutely. I had no idea what I was getting into. But, I was full of conviction and, got them on board. It took me forever to figure out the licensing. I hired some attorneys that thought they knew what they were doing, got the wrong licenses, and had to start over. But the families stayed with me for 2 years while I kind of sorted it out. I kept offering to give them kind of a deposit in good faith, and they wouldn't take the money. So, I was super fortunate in that sense. And once I got my licensing, it was, all right, now what do I do? And trying to find distributors. and yeah, it's been a wild ride.
That's kind of amazing. And how has it been working with the mezcaleros? Because as I continue my sort of mezcal journey, I've come to realize that each bottle, while it is a spirit and it is a good representation of the agriculture of the region, it also seems to be a good representation of the families and the community that make it. Because it's not like some bigger box spirits to where it's a machine operation with products from all over the place. It seems to be homegrown with very few people that represent each particular label.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate. I've been doing this since 2012, and so the families or the brands that I work with, are owned by the people that produce them, with a couple of exceptions, or family-owned brands. I guess a couple of exceptions would be like Aguerrido, where it's a co-op of producers. But for me, these are families that have been doing this for multiple generations, within the community, sticking to the traditional techniques in which they've made mezcal, right? And so, I think earlier I mentioned this was kind of a transfer of knowledge in how to make mezcal. And, each generation kind of puts their own spin on it based on what they learned from their fathers or grandfathers. And, for me, it's really just letting them kind of do their own thing and not influencing on their productions. You'll see across the board with all the brands that we represent, the ABVs are constantly changing, different ensembles of different things, and, really just supporting them. Early on, I tasted every batch, and, there's this trust between us that, oftentimes I purchase batches without tasting them, or I taste them once they're actually in the US.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of awesome. And what process do you go through when it comes to finding a brand, finding a label, and deciding to try to make it a part of your portfolio? Because I feel like it's not as simple as going in, grabbing, a couple boxes and boom, you're done.
No. So, I guess through the educational process that I went through early on, in my mind, I already had a roadmap, kind of where I wanted to take heavy metal and who I wanted to work with. So, at the time, most people, and I was one of them, thought all mezcal came from Oaxaca, and figured that, if I'm going to launch this company, I need to start with mezcal from Oaxaca. Heavy metal is kind of a fun play on words, right? So metal.
I was going to ask where the name comes from. You're a big fan of the 80s cartoon movie, and obviously I know there's a magazine and all sorts of other stuff, but where does this come from?
Yeah, so, metal is the Aztec word for agave.
Oh, okay.
That's where the origin of the word mezcal comes from, metal ixcali, or cooked agave. And so, for me, the heavy part was kind of a fun play on words, and really it's about getting deep and profound on agave spirits. So, I had this roadmap, wanted to launch with mezcales from Oaxaca before jumping out and starting to bring things in from other states, kind of watching the market, seeing the trends, and then slowly adding these families or producers that I've known throughout the years. And so, started in Oaxaca and then jumped to Jalisco with the Partida family at Chacolo, Caballito Cerrero, which is basically the tequila that's not a tequila.
Okay.
Down to, also had Gusto Histórico from Oaxaca, which really kind of represents the importance of your water source, and really the terroir really comes through. But yeah, it's representing all these different things, Rey Campero, copper distillation, Real Minero, clay pot, Gusto Histórico, copper, and also Refrescadera. We jump over to Chacolo, and it's obviously different agaves, all distilled out of hollowed out tree trunks. And really, it's all about education on the category as thoughtfully as I can.
Gotcha. And it kind of brings me to the grand tasting at Mezcal Lauderdale, which you are going to be at. And how difficult is it for somebody to come up to you? You've got different expressions from different brands. How do you know how to take them on a mezcal journey? How do you know where to start, where to gradually move them to without either overloading them or giving them more than what they could conceivably handle, shall we say?
That's a tough one, right? So, given the number of brands that we work with, we definitely pare it down to a couple SKUs per brand. But in deciding where we start people, is talking with them, seeing if they're familiar with any of the brands, what they like or dislike in mezcal, and based on those conversations, trying to make recommendations, and then based on the reactions, kind of taking them in different directions.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what are you going to be bringing? I know one of the brands that I was very interested in, and I know Andrew put it up on the Mezcal Lauderdale Instagram page, is a particular label called Aguerrido. It's got one heck of a story behind it as well.
Yeah, Aguerrido is a wonderful little co-op out of Guerrero. It's 5 producers, or 6 if you count a husband and wife team as individuals. But Aguerrido, these maestros and maestras were part of another co-op that I began speaking with in 2012 called San Secan. And we just had a hard time moving forward. And ultimately, they decided to create their own co-op, which allowed me to begin working with them or bringing them into the U.S., right? So in Guerrero, they primarily work with Cupriata. There are espadins and agaves like Sacatoro and Caballito. Primarily it's Cupriata, so it's different maestros working with Cupriata. It's being harvested in different soil types. So, on the back labels of each of these, we call out the specific soil type that the agaves were harvested from for each production, which is kind of neat. For those that really want to geek out, they can follow a certain producer and the different batches and taste different, cupriatas coming from different soil types. But really, really cool project. Things are really tough in Guerrero. It's very unsafe. And so, for me personally, it's very rewarding trying to help them and promote this idea or this brand of aguerrido, which is warrior in English. They're fighting to preserve traditional mezcal in Guerrero.
Gotcha. That's amazing. That is amazing. You also mentioned, I guess I'm nowhere near as good at my Spanish pronunciation as you are, so I apologize. But you had mentioned one that is a tequila without being a tequila.
Yeah, so that's Caballito Cerrero.
And that's the one with the horse on the front, which
yes, sir. So Caballito Cerrero is made in Amatitan in Jalisco, the heart of tequila country. This family, the Jimenez, have been making agave distillates for 15 generations. On their property, they've got the oldest known vestiges of agave production dating back to like the mid 1500s.
Interesting.
So, fast forward, they eventually in the late 1800s built a modern distillery and began producing tequila. There was a little brand coming out of there called Herradura. And in the 1950s, the family separates. The Jimenez stay in the distillery and create the brand with literally Wild Mountain Horse, or simply, because horses don't require horseshoes to get around.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So I guess what are some of the other mezcals that I can look forward to sampling on June 22nd?
Yeah, so, we're going to have some Campero, Real Minero, some Aguerrido, some Chacolo, Palomas Mensajeras from Michoacan, which is relatively new to us. They haven't been in the portfolio but a year now. And then we'll have some Uruapan, which is Charanda from Michoacan, which is basically a DO-protected sugarcane distillate.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's kind of interesting. There's a lot of spirits that I think of when I think of Mexico. Rum is not one of them. Or a cane distillate. I don't know if it can be called rum.
Well, the government's required us to put the word rum on the label, but we're trying to really focus and push this seldomly recognized DO, which is China.
Interesting. So it's a whole different environment. And talk about that, because it's kind of I guess what makes it so different, and why are people going to be shocked if they don't taste Bacardi when they try this?
Oh, well, I mean, shoot, there are a number of factors, but this family's got 5 different sugarcane varieties growing on their property. So from the blended one through the 100%, this is going to be state-grown cane that's harvested in the morning, pressed the same day, open air, wild, fermented, then distilled in wood-fired copper pot stills. In the blended one, the other 50% is going to be molasses coming from one of 2 refineries that they sell their excess cane to. They're going to bring that molasses, open air, ferment it in stainless steel tanks. So you've got ambient and proprietary yeast being used in that fermentation. Then it's going to be distilled in a small column still, very similar to like an Armagnac still. And then the 2 finished products are going to be blended together to create the blended Blanco, or some people call it the blue bottle because the bottle's painted blue. But really, really unique spirits. My company is Heavy Metl. This has nothing to do with agave. But
Mhm.
in learning the family story, on the neck of all the bottles, it says since 1907. And that date's really important because prior to 1907, the Pacheco family were actually mezcaleros. And the price of mezcal was way down. There was no income, so they switched over to sugarcane distillates. And for me, that was kind of the bridge that I needed for them to work within the portfolio. Not only that, just hearing about this category that's in decline. Most people that are producing within the DO are calling it ron or aguardiente. So here it's really about preserving this category.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Hey, I find it interesting, especially how many legal requirements and whatnot go into what you can even call it. Because you've got another one in your portfolio, the Chocolo. It's an agave spirit, but illegally it can't be called mezcal or tequila.
That's correct. So, locally they call it vino mezcal. Legally, they can't call it mezcal because, well, where they are doesn't fall within the DO of mezcal. And they also don't work with Tequilana Weber, so they wouldn't qualify as being tequila either. But, a lot of the brands that we work with are actually agave spirits, with the exception of Rey Campero, who is a mezcal, and Sotoleros, which obviously is a sotol, and the Uruapan, which is charanda.
That's amazing. And can you actually talk about the sotol for a little bit, because it's some other importers are very amazed with Mezcal Lauderdale because it's not just mezcal. Obviously, tequila is not going to be there, but mezcals are there, some bacanoras and some other ones such as sotol. So you have one that's coming, I would assume.
Yeah, I can't remember which one we selected for the show.
Okay.
But we work with a brand called Sotoleros, which is a project by Ricardo Pico. He works with sources, I guess, if you will, from different small producers throughout Chihuahua. You've got stuff coming from high altitude like Ciudad Madera or City of Wood. So those are going to be very piney, kind of mossy. You've got some coming from the desert, which can, just all sorts of different flavor profiles, different agave or daisy lyriums. But, sotol can also be made in two other states, Coahuila and Durango. So, with all the different types of daisy lyrium that you're finding in the different states, different production techniques, terroir, water, they can vary drastically.
Gotcha. That's amazing. So I am excited to be able to try some of what you're bringing. I think Mezcal Lauderdale is going to be a great event this year, and can't wait to meet you and everyone else there.
Well, come on by. Looking forward to seeing you. And, there's one brand that we haven't spoken about.
Oh, and what is that? Get some interesting.
While you saw it on the website, it is literally on a truck up from San Luis Potosí to Texas. And we will be showing a bottle of it at Mezcal Lauderdale.
Awesome. And I guess, so it's on the truck right now. It's going to be fresh from the distiller, I would assume.
Absolutely. So these are batches that were made last year. They've been sitting in glass. They're all agave salmiana distilled in clay pots. What we'll have at Mezcal Lauderdale is a blend of 3 different agave salmiana.
Okay.
Really cool, very different flavor profiles. The salmiana are obviously going to be pit roasted, if you will. Then they're only going to ferment the juice, but in the fermentation, they're adding pulque to help jumpstart the fermentation. So these are going to be some really wild and different notes.
And pulque, I guess it's worth kind of going back a little bit into Mezcal's history, because pulque is sort of like proto-Mezcal almost, pre-Spanish spirit, from what I see.
So pulque is just kind of another byproduct, if you will, from the agave. Not all agaves will produce pulque, but basically you can cut the top of the agave, carve in like a little bowl on the top of the plant, The plant will begin to excrete this liquid that's collected in the mornings and in the evenings.
Interesting.
And so basically they'll come in the morning, collect the liquid, they'll scrape it out. Essentially, for lack of a better analogy, they're picking the scab, if you will, and then this liquid excretes. They come and collect it in the evenings, scrape it again, and continue to do so. This comes out as agua miel, and over time, as it ferments, it becomes pulque.
Interesting.
So it comes out clear. Most people think of pulque being kind of viscous, kind of milky in color. But they're essentially taking the agua miel to help jumpstart their fermentation.
Huh. And I guess what kind of flavor profiles will we be experiencing with that? That sounds really amazing.
Well, I think, I'd love to tell you. I just encourage y'all to taste it and be prepared for something that's totally different. This is, these are mezcales or destilados de agave that I was lucky enough to taste in like 2012, 2013, and was absolutely blown away by this flavor profile. And I'm super stoked to finally be bringing these into the U.S., 12 years later.
That's awesome. I cannot wait to try these. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it. All right, so that is it for the pre-workout. Now we've got the main event coming up on our next episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, live from the event at Sistrunk Marketplace in downtown Fort Lauderdale. That's going to be on our next episode, so I definitely recommend that you follow us on social media to find out when that gets released. And to do that, all you have to do is go to Florida Beer Blog on Instagram, Threads, X, and Blue Sky. We are also at FL Beer Blog on Facebook. We are also on the internet at floridabeerblog.com and floridabeerpodcast.com, or you can always email us at floridabeerblog@gmail.com. We are available on pretty much every podcasting app you can think of. We are on Apple Music, Google Podcasts. Actually, that just disappeared, so don't worry about them. We're on Amazon, however, and iHeartRadio, Spotify, and so much more. If you have a smart speaker, you can very easily ask it to play the latest episode of the Florida Beer Podcast, and that's what will happen. Or even on YouTube, because YouTube is a big podcasting app as well. We are also a proud member of the Florida Podcast Network, a collection of amazing podcasts that you will definitely love, made by people right here in the Sunshine State. You can find more information about them at floridapodcastnetwork.com. If you are listening to us on the podcasting app of your choice, I do recommend that you follow us, like us, give us a subscribe, and a nice 5-star review. It does help us get the word out. Our intro announcer is Jeff Brozovich. Field producer is Steve Pekala. Executive producer of the Florida Podcast Network and Grand High Poobah is Jemmy Legagneur. This is David Butler, your host and author. And we will see you next week for another episode of the Florida Beer Podcast. Other than that, thank you so much for listening, and drink Florida Craft.